There is a version of this man that the whole world knows. The version with the leather jacket and the whip. The version in the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon, fingers flying over buttons that don't actually do anything, grinning like he invented cool. The version that made 3 generations of children believe that ordinary people could outrun extraordinary evil. That version has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. That version has a net worth in the hundreds of millions of dollars. That version is one of the most recognizable faces in the history of cinema. But there is another version, a quieter one that not many people get to see, one that wakes up before dawn on a ranch in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and stands alone at the edge of the land in the cold gray light, watching the mountains, not saying a word. One that has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, something that fame and money and 1,000 standing ovations cannot touch. Because here is the question that nobody asks about Harrison Ford. What does a man do when the very thing that made him legendary also cost him everything that mattered most? And here is the question underneath that question. Who was he before the world told him who he was supposed to be? And here is the question that might keep you watching until the very end. What silent war has he been fighting at 83? One that has nothing to do with Nazis or Sith Lords or anything you have ever seen on a screen. To understand any of that, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to Hollywood. Not to the moment the camera first loved his face. You have to go back to a small apartment in the Rogers Park neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois, where a boy named Harrison Ford was born on July 13, 1942, to a family that was holding itself together with the kind of quiet dignity that working-class families specialize in. His father, Christopher Ford, was an advertising executive of Irish Catholic descent. His mother, Dorothy Neidleman, came from a Russian-Jewish immigrant background. That combination alone tells you something. Here was a child born between 2 worlds, 2 histories, 2 different ways of making sense of suffering and survival. He didn't have the language for it yet. He was just a kid. But that tension, that in-between-ness, would follow him everywhere. Chicago in the 1940s was not a gentle place to grow up. The wind off Lake Michigan had an opinion about every morning. The streets were loud and honest, and the people who lived in them had learned not to waste energy on pretense. Harrison Ford absorbed that. He grew up quiet, observant, a boy who watched more than he spoke, who noticed things other people walked past. His younger brother Terrence was born in 1945, and the 2 of them were raised in a household where love was expressed through presence rather than declaration. His father worked. His mother managed the home. They were not rich. They were not desperate. They were exactly what they were, a Midwestern family doing what Midwestern families do, which is to put their heads down and keep going. Harrison attended Maine East High School in Park Ridge, Illinois, a suburban campus where the social hierarchies were as rigid as anywhere else, and where a quiet, unassuming boy with no particular athletic talent and no burning ambition to be noticed did not exactly set the world on fire. He wasn't popular. He wasn't unpopular. He was something more difficult than either. He was invisible. The kind of invisible that young people carry like a bruise. Not bullied, not celebrated. Just there. And there is a particular loneliness in that kind of adolescence that people don't talk about enough. The loneliness of being overlooked. Of walking through a crowded hallway and knowing that nobody is really looking at you. Of sitting at the edge of a lunch table and feeling the geography of exclusion without anyone having to say a word. He went on to Ripon College in Wisconsin, a small liberal arts school, where he stumbled into a drama class more or less by accident. And something shifted. Not dramatically, not like a thunderclap, more like a window being cracked open in a room that had been sealed for too long. For the first time in his life, there was a space where his quietness became interesting, where his careful observation of human behavior was actually an asset, where being someone else, stepping into another person's skin and trying to feel what they felt, gave him a way to understand feelings he could not yet name in his own life. He fell in love with acting the way people fall in love when they don't realize it's happening. Slowly, then completely. But falling in love with something and making it pay the rent are two very different things, and Harrison Ford was about to learn that distinction in the hardest possible way. He graduated from Ripon in 1964, married his college sweetheart Mary Marquardt the following year, and moved to Los Angeles chasing a dream that Los Angeles is specifically designed to crush. He signed a small contract with Columbia Pictures. He made some minor film appearances. He got let go. He signed with Universal. He made some television work, bit parts, background roles, the kind of work that keeps you employed without bringing you any closer to where you want to be. Studio executives told him he didn't have what it took. One in particular, a man at Columbia named Jerry Tokofsky, looked at the young Harrison Ford and told him, bluntly, that he lacked the star quality that real leading men had. He pointed to the scar on Ford's chin, a scar Ford had gotten in a car accident in 1968, as evidence of something flawed, something unpolished. That moment, that specific moment in a studio office that smelled like cigarettes and ambition and casual cruelty. That is the moment Harrison Ford carried with him for years, not because it destroyed him, but because he let it almost define him. He was in his late 20s. He had a wife. He had a son, Benjamin, born in 1967. He had another son, Willard, born in 1969. He had rent to pay and a family that needed him to bring something home, and the city of Los Angeles was laughing at him in that quiet, impersonal way that cities laugh, not because it wants to hurt you, but because it simply doesn't care either way. He made one of the bravest decisions a prideful man can make. He became a carpenter, not a metaphorical carpenter, an actual carpenter. He taught himself the trade with the same methodical seriousness he brought to everything, and he got good at it. Really good. He worked on homes and offices across Los Angeles, and there is something almost unbearably poetic about the image. Harrison Ford, the future Han Solo, the future Indiana Jones, on his knees with a hammer in his hand, building things for other people while his own dream sat quietly in the corner, waiting. He has talked about this period in interviews with a kind of flatness that hides more than it reveals. He'll say something like, "I was just trying to survive." He'll say, "I had responsibilities." What he doesn't often say is what it costs a man to watch his dream recede into the distance while he measures lumber and drives screws and tries to figure out whether the life he's living is a temporary detour or a permanent destination. What he doesn't often say is how many times he must have stood at the end of a workday, hands rough and sore, and wondered if that studio executive was right, if there really was something missing, something that all the craft and all the commitment in the world couldn't manufacture. He kept going anyway. He took small acting jobs when they came. He did not quit. He just kept his hands busy and his hope alive and his resentment. Because of course there was resentment. He was human. He kept his resentment quiet. That might be the most Harrison Ford thing about him. The resentment stayed private. So did the hope. And then, in 1973, a friend got him an audition. The friend was an actor named Richard Dreyfuss. The director was George Lucas. The film was called American Graffiti, a nostalgic, low-budget ensemble piece about teenagers on one last summer night before the world pulls them apart. Harrison Ford had a small role, a very small role. He played Bob Falfa, a drag racer, a cowboy swagger of a character who exists largely to be cool and then to crash dramatically. He was on screen for maybe 12 minutes total. But something happened in those 12 minutes. Something in the way Ford held himself, something in the casual, barely contained confidence of his performance. Lucas noticed it. 2 years later, Lucas was casting for a science fiction film that nobody believed in. A crazy, expensive, complicated film set in outer space, based on a screenplay that read like mythology crossed with Saturday morning serials. The studio was nervous. The concept was wild. And Lucas needed someone to play Han Solo, a character who was essentially the human heart of the whole thing, the cynic who becomes a believer, the man who pretends not to care and then risks everything because he actually cares enormously. Ford was working at the studio at the time, literally installing a door. He was the carpenter, doing a job, and George Lucas brought him in to read lines with auditioning actresses. Not because Ford was being considered, but because Lucas needed someone to read the scenes. And Ford read Han Solo. Just like that. Just like that, everything changed. Star Wars came out on May 25, 1977, and it did something to the culture that is almost impossible to explain to anyone who didn't live through it. It wasn't just a hit. It was a seismic event. People lined up around city blocks in the summer heat. Children who had never cared about movies sat in dark theaters and felt their hearts move in ways they would spend the rest of their lives trying to recreate. And Harrison Ford, the invisible boy from Chicago, the rejected actor, the carpenter who kept his hope in a quiet corner, was suddenly one of the most famous human beings on the planet. The success was staggering. The franchise multiplied. The Empire Strikes Back in 1980, Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1981, Return of the Jedi in 1983, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom in 1984. Film after film after film, each one adding another layer to a legacy that was becoming something larger than any individual movie. Harrison Ford was not just a movie star. He was an archetype. He was the version of the American hero that a particular generation believed in most deeply. Imperfect, reluctant, funny, loyal in the end. And yet there is always a price. His marriage to Mary Marquardt ended in 1979. The years of struggle, the years of absence, the years of a man pouring himself into a dream that his family had waited patiently for. They had taken their toll in ways that don't show up in the press releases. Two sons, Benjamin and Willard, grew up watching their father become a legend and had complicated feelings about all of it, the way children of famous people always do. There is no clean way to be raised by someone who also belongs to the world. In 1983, Harrison Ford married screenwriter Melissa Matheson, and they had 2 children together, Georgia and Malcolm. For a while it seemed like he had found his footing in a personal life that the public never fully saw. Melissa was brilliant and warm, a deeply private woman who wrote E.T. the Extraterrestrial and understood storytelling at a bone-deep level. They were, by most accounts, genuinely good together. But the work kept pulling. The absences kept accumulating. The fame kept building its invisible wall between a man and the quieter life he sometimes seemed to want. And in 2001, after 18 years of marriage, that chapter also ended. There is something Harrison Ford said in an interview years later that has stayed with me. He said, "I'm not very good at being human." He said it with a laugh, the way he says most painful things, with a kind of wry deflection that is probably the only way he knows how to let people see inside. But underneath the laugh, there is a man who has spent decades trying to figure out the gap between who he is in his public life, fearless, magnetic, larger than the screen, and who he is when the cameras are off and the house is quiet, and it's just him and his own history. Because the real battle, the silent one, the one at 83 that this story is actually about, is not against aging, though that is part of it. It is not against the industry, though Hollywood is complicated and always has been. The real battle is the one every human being who has lived long enough eventually faces. The battle to make peace with the life you actually lived, as opposed to the life you imagined. In 2010, he married actress Callista Flockhart, whom he had met at the Golden Globes in 2002 when he tripped on the step and she caught his arm. And if that is not a metaphor for something, then nothing is. Callista is 13 years younger than him. She brought with her a son, Liam, whom Harrison adopted. And in this marriage, this third attempt at the thing he had always struggled to sustain, something seemed to settle. Something seemed to find ground. They live now between Los Angeles and a large ranch in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And it is the ranch, this specific piece of land that Harrison Ford has owned for decades, where he pilots his helicopters and small planes, where he has landed in fields to help stranded hikers, where he has sat alone watching the mountains. That tells you who he really is underneath all the mythology. A man who needs space. A man who needs sky above him and earth under his feet and distance from the noise. A man who, even at 83, is more comfortable outdoors than in any room where people are watching him. He is a pilot. He has been flying since the 1980s, and he approaches it with the same seriousness he brings to everything. He has survived accidents. A crash in 2015 when his vintage Ryan ST monoplane went down on a golf course in Venice, California, leaving him with a broken pelvis, a broken ankle, a lacerated scalp, and the kind of injuries that at 72 would have grounded most men permanently. He recovered. He went back to flying. Because of course he did. That's who he is. He flew a helicopter in 2015 and landed to rescue a stranded Boy Scout in Wyoming's Bridger-Teton National Forest. Not because anyone was watching. Not because it made good publicity. Because a kid needed help and Harrison Ford had a helicopter and the skill to land it in a tight spot. That story got out the way good stories get out, quietly, through the people involved, without a press release. And this is where the philosophy lives, if you want to call it that. Harrison Ford has never been a man who talks much about what he believes. He is not religious in any traditional sense, has described himself variously as agnostic, and as someone who finds his spiritual grounding in the natural world, in the sky when he's flying, in the land when he's working it, in the silence that comes when you're high enough above the noise to hear yourself think. He doesn't preach. He doesn't perform belief. He just tries to be useful. He just tries to show up. That is harder than it sounds, especially at 83, when the body is doing things the mind refuses to accept, when the work that once came easily now requires a different kind of discipline, when the face in the mirror looks like a version of yourself you are still getting acquainted with. Harrison Ford returned as Indiana Jones in 2023's Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, a film that asked him, at the age of 80, to inhabit a character he first played at 38, to carry all that history in his bones while still making a room believe he could outrun anything. The film was not perfect, but his performance was something else. There were moments in it that had nothing to do with action sequences and everything to do with a man allowing his own grief and his own years to show on his face for the first time. And that kind of honesty on film is not something you can manufacture. It comes from having actually lived. He said in one interview around that time that he found the emotional scenes in that film more draining than the physical ones. Not because the emotions were hard to access, because they were too easy. Because Indy's exhaustion and Indy's longing and Indy's reckoning with a life that has cost him things he cannot get back. All of that was right there, right on the surface, with no distance at all between the character and the man playing him. That, perhaps, is the most honest thing Harrison Ford has ever put on screen. And he put it there at 80, in what may be the last chapter of a franchise that began before many of his viewers were born. There is a moment in the ranch at Jackson Hole, in the early morning before the noise of the world begins, when the mountains are still purple with the last of the night, and the air is cold enough to see your breath, and everything is quiet in the way that only very large open spaces can be quiet. A quiet that is not empty but full of the sound of wind and the distant call of a bird, and the particular peace that comes from being small beneath a very big sky. Harrison Ford has stood in that moment thousands of times. It is his. Nobody can take it. Not the press, not the critics, not the people who have spent 50 years projecting their own fantasies onto his face. That moment is who he is. That is the real man, the one underneath Han Solo and Indiana Jones and all the rest. A man who needs the sky above him and the earth under his boots and nobody asking him to be anything other than exactly what he is. And now I want to speak directly to you. You have been watching this because something in you recognized something in him. Maybe it was the invisible years, the years of working hard at something while the world ignored you, wondering whether the effort would ever be enough, whether you had what it takes, whether that voice in the back of your head telling you to give up was actually right. Maybe it was the marriages, the complicated love, the way the people who matter most can drift to the periphery when you're too consumed by the thing you're building. Maybe it was just the image of an old man standing alone on his ranch in Wyoming at dawn, watching the mountains, at peace with something that took a very long time to find. Because here is what Harrison Ford's life actually teaches. If you strip away the mythology and the box office numbers and the franchise sequels, the invisible years are not wasted years. The years of being overlooked, of working a job that isn't your dream while you keep your dream alive in whatever corner you can find for it. Those years are not failure. They are formation. They are where you learn who you are when nobody is watching. They are where you discover whether you have enough in you to keep going when the keeping going produces nothing visible, nothing measurable, nothing that anyone else can see. And the ranch in Wyoming, that quiet mountain morning that Harrison Ford returns to again and again, is not the reward at the end of the story. It is the thing he was always moving toward, even when he didn't know it. The space, the silence, the right to stand on your own land and watch the sky and not owe anyone an explanation for who you've become. You will face a moment, maybe you're in it right now, when the work you care about most seems to be going nowhere, when the people around you seem to be advancing and you seem to be standing still, when some version of a studio executive, literal or metaphorical, looks at the scar on your chin and tells you that what makes you specific also makes you inadequate. That moment is not the end of your story. It is the door. It is the cold Chicago morning and the lumber and the hammer and the quiet decision to keep going anyway. Harrison Ford kept going. At 83, he is still flying, still working, still standing at the edge of his ranch in the blue hour before dawn, watching the mountains with the kind of attention that most people reserve for the things that haven't happened yet. But he's not watching for the future. He's watching the sky itself, the same sky that has been above him for all of it, the invisible years and the famous years and every difficult, beautiful, ordinary morning in between. What are you building while the world isn't watching? And when the world finally turns to look, will you have kept enough of yourself intact to still know who you are?